and a very warm welcome to Deciphering Design with Dikshu. Dikshu Kukreja, an ace Indian architect who believes in transforming the way design is looked in India. He wants to break the silos of the way design is perceived in our society. Let's go across to him to know what is the show all about today.
What have been some of your most memorable takeaways from a city? The streets, the lakes, the parks and plazas. How they have brought life and color to our most favorite destinations. Historically as well, our public spaces comprised of bazaars and mohallas, which have today transformed into plazas, malls and corporate parks. Yet these spaces continue to significantly define the way we communicate and participate with our surroundings. However, with changing times, our public spaces have been at the receiving end as well. Burgeoning cities that need space to accommodate more people have continuously encroached on our open spaces. There is now a growing realization of the potential of design and its impact on our living. But has it all been for the better? What have been some learnings through these changes? Most of all, how have human habits been influenced? From using buildings for street art to integrating smart technology and revitalizing our parks and riverfronts, public spaces have added value to people's spirits. Many shared outdoor spaces in the world have also seen a change for the better, owing to the grit and perseverance of its users. How can we take design inspiration from cities around the world as well as our heritage towns to create better urban spaces in Indian cities? In today's episode, we discuss how redesigning of public spaces can contribute to the well-being of a city and decipher ways of making them more inspirational. Our guest this evening is not just a distinguished diplomat, he is an authority on architecture. He has authored many books. He is also on the jury of the famous Pritzker Prize. He has represented his country in United Nations on climate change and sustainability. Meet the ambassador of Brazil to India and a dear friend, Andre Correa do Lago. Welcome, Andre. It's such a pleasure to be in this magnificent home, and we have thoroughly enjoyed our many conversations in the past on architecture. So today we get to talk about how do we really decipher design. But before we get to all of that, I want to know from you that where and when did you develop this interest in architecture?
Well, as a Brazilian, I grew up in a generation where architecture was the biggest symbol of the country, because I was born in '59 and that was the time that Brasilia, the new capital, was about to be inaugurated. So everybody in Brazil was talking about architecture. And Brasilia somehow symbolized the country that Brazil wanted to become. A country with personality, a modern country, an innovative country. And so I am from a generation where architecture was everything. And it was also a time in which there was a great appreciation on colonial architecture in Brazil also. So architecture was very present, even if my father was a diplomat, but my mother would talk at home about architecture. So architecture was really very present in my generation.
And when we think about Brazil, we always talk about, and even with Brasilia as a city itself, when it's been one of those few cities in the world which has been a brand new city designed in the 20th century as a country's nation's capital, it's also a lot to do with the public spaces. And that's what we want to talk about here today, that for Brazil, whether it's the carnival that we all over the world recognize Brazil for, or the beaches, or the public spaces or places that are there in Brasilia, how do people look at these public places? How important are they for society out there?
Well, you know, like India, Brazil is a very, very large country, and but most of Brazil really has a very kind weather. So the public space is very important because we are most of the time outside. So you have obviously a huge variation because of the size of the country, but each city is very proud of its public spaces. And I think that it's quite interesting to see how you have traditional public spaces like in old cities and how you have man-made public spaces, which is, I think, the great challenge. How can you design a public space that people adopt? And we have some very interesting cases in Brazil.
Even in India, for that matter, we've had, you know, Indian society has also, I believe, thrived on public spaces, whether it's been our streets or our plazas or the public meeting space, let's say at the corner of a street that leads you from your neighborhood into the main avenue. I mean, it's full. Our cities have thrived on that. And those have now gone through a transformation in the 21st century. How do you see that, how society perceived public spaces 100 years ago and now in the 21st century? Do you see any design changes that have happened?
I think that the public space is one of the greatest challenges of contemporary architecture, because it's very curious, because most people live in, like in India or in Brazil, in cities that are quite recent, because our countries were agrarian societies that little by little adopted bigger and bigger cities. And there is always like a reference to old squares, to old streets, and how people are resistant to architect or urbanist designed spaces. And I think it's quite unfair, because there are some spaces that are designed for it that work very well. But I think this is the great challenge. How, for instance, in the case of India, how you're going to have tens and tens of cities of more than 10 million people. How do you create spaces that make people happy to be in the city and not miss old kinds of spaces? And Brazil today is mostly urban. We are almost 90% urban. Yeah, so our transition was very, very quick. So we have lots of experience in that sense. And obviously there were many mistakes, like everywhere. But I think that we have some very interesting cases that I would love to share with you.
I agree with you. And this approach about having a local influence and even an individual influence, I mean, moving from a public place, if we look at your own home, which I think is one of the finest brought up as a design, how it's been put together. It has the influences of Brazil in every nook and corner. It has influences of your wife's French background in the home. So it's beautiful in that sense. In fact, the room that we are sitting here in has been featured as one of the most beautiful rooms in the world. So I agree with you there that, you know, local influence, individual preferences must come, and there's not that global approach, especially when we talk about public spaces. They must be having that kind of a character.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned, for instance, this room, I think that in architecture or in design, you are trying to send somehow a message. It's like the way that you talk, the way that you dress, the way that you behave. you're sending messages. And obviously when you are in an embassy, in the case in the Brazilian embassy, I think that one of the main messages about Brazil is diversity and the mix, because Brazil is the result of a great mix. In this we are very different from India. India has 5,000 years of intense history, of lots of different civilizations, and so it's an extremely complex country. And I think this must be reflected in its cities. In the case of Brazil, what we have is that we had lots of immigration, we had lots of different kinds of population that came to Brazil, and somehow built a culture that is very particular, because it's a culture that we say that absorbs things and somehow deconstructs everything into something more relaxed and is Brazilian. Be it the influence from Europe, the influence from Africa, the influence from the indigenous, or even the influence from Asia, because we have the largest Japanese population outside of Japan, for instance.
But Andre, in that sense, I would say that Brazil and India do still have a similar notion, and that is about diversity. That yes, in the case of Brazil, there's been so much of immigration that has taken place and brought that diversity into the country. In India, it's been a homegrown diversity. If you move from one part of the country to another, you see that kind of a thing. India and Brazil, I've always felt we might be two countries which are on opposite sides of the globe, but there are so many similarities that one discovers. It's really intriguing. I remember when I was designing a project for a Brazilian multinational company here, Pedro, in Jaipur, and we used to talk about this also, if you recall, and how there were so many similarities that came about in the design thinking, the design approach. It's very, very interesting that we are so far apart geographically, and yet the minds, the approach of people, the idea of celebration when you talk about beaches and parks out there, how beaches and parks in our country also, whether it's Mumbai, Chennai, Delhi, Bangalore, these are really public spaces that people associate themselves with so much. It's something which is an intrinsic part of people's lives.
Yes, and there is an interesting similarity between our two countries too, is that after the war, after 1945, and when you became independent in 47, and Brazil was industrializing and could profit very much of the post-war boom economically. Our countries wanted to stress their personality internationally, and modern architecture was a very important element. If you think the two largest and most ambitious urban projects in the 20th century are Chandigarh and Brasilia. And what the whole generation of architects in India, they followed this idea that there was a new India, that it was not in one direction or the other, it was something that was starting anew. So modern architecture was an instrument that we wanted to create, how we wanted to present our country.
And your involvement with the Pritzker Prize, and we had this conversation once about how really on this planet, architecture is not just about intervening and creating new built environment, but sometimes it's about restoring. We don't have to have a fancy for demolishing stuff. We can always preserve buildings, and buildings is not alone which makes architecture. The public spaces, the urban design interventions make architecture as well. What are your thoughts about it? And I know there's been recently the announcement of the new Pritzker Prize winner, and that in itself sends a message about a slight departure from the conventional thinking of just demolishing buildings and making them new.
Absolutely. The 2021 Pritzker Prize was awarded to a French firm, a couple, Lacaton and Vassal, and their work is simply amazing, because when they are ordered to do something, or they are called for a project, the first thing they want is to use everything that is already available there. There is a famous story of that they were asked to redesign a square, and we were talking about public space. And they went there, they interviewed the people in the city, they analyzed the place, etc. And they came back to the client, the city, and said, the best thing is not to do anything. So, because the square works and people like the square, and why do we have to redo something that is working? So, which is the utmost minimalist approach.
It is, of course. That's what public places are about. So, you know, we are on this journey to decipher design, to look at different facets of design. And when we talk about public places, I would love it if you would share your thoughts about public places are meant for the public, which is the viewers watching this show. How can our viewers actually get involved in making their voice heard, making their thoughts shared in terms of what that public space should be, like the example you just gave a bit earlier?
I think that in recent years, some very important architects, one great example is the Chilean architect Alejandro Aranha. They have developed an architecture that has to include what the locals think about the place, because for many years, modern architecture wanted to be, as we mentioned, something a bit universal, and you would see a photograph and you didn't know if it was in a continent or in another continent. So Alejandro and lots of other important architects started to listen to the people and to listen what they are, what they want for their life. And naturally, these people are not architects, but what these people think, because they're going to be the users, has to be taken into consideration.
So like I say, that if 20th century belonged to modern architecture, I think 21st century has to belong to a more participative architecture, a more contextual architecture. That's the way we need to look at it, because we cannot be sitting in our ivory towers trying to design for the world. We need to involve the world, especially when it comes to public places. After all, when we are designing something for the public, how can you not have their participation in it? So I think you've touched a very important point, and I think that's the way forward when we look at architecture for the future. So it's been fascinating having this conversation with you, and I know we can go on about this and talk about a mutually favorite subject, but truly it's been delightful, and thank you very much. I'm sure we'll continue this journey of deciphering design with you in days and times to come.
Thank you very much.
Stay with us on the other side of the break.
Hello and welcome back. You're watching Deciphering Design with Dikshu. Dikshu, today is an interesting episode. You're talking about public spaces. You've had your section of conversation. I think it's time for me to ask you a few things, and few things which actually I have a lot of concern about, because public spaces and architecture is something I don't think people understand very well. People feel when it's a public space, there is no design element to it, which is, I think, a very wrong thing. First and foremost, I would want to know from you that, you have been involved in designing some of the very important buildings, public spaces in this part of the world. The tallest building in South Asia, in Sri Lanka, and you're also designing the convention center, which is for the G20 summit, which is happening in Delhi. What is your concept and idea when you design public spaces?
So Richa, you're right. We are here to actually decipher design, and design is not just about buildings. Buildings are just part of the experience that we have in our cities. It's also about the public spaces that make or break the city, I feel. So about these projects, for instance, what we are doing in Sri Lanka, it is a very tall building. It's going 120 stories. It's literally touching the sky. So in these kind of projects, you are physically probably taking people away from the ground, but how do you give them still a sense of ground, a sense of belonging? So it's all about creating landscape, bringing nature in different levels of the building, and letting there be spaces even within a high-rise building where people can meet each other. So kind of creating public spaces. It could be terrace gardens, it could be various facilities, lounges, where public or people rather can interact with each other. So that is one aspect. Similarly, in the Dwarka project, it's a very large convention center. There'll be tens of thousands of people gathering there. So how do you bring in the aspects of whether it's security, whether it's universally being accessible to all people, even if there are any kind of, let's say, disabilities with them. Also about creating multifunctional use. You could be having rock concerts there, you could be watching a cricket World Cup final out there, so you'll have lots of people there. How do you design these spaces which are, even from a climate point of view, very relevant? Because our climate, a hot climate in Delhi, even a shade of a tree can make all the difference. Even the mist coming from a fountain can make a big difference. So how do you integrate all these design elements into a public space? That's what we are trying to do there.
Interestingly, in India, if we talk about public spaces have always been a part, be that mohallas, bazaar, chowk, angans at home, that's always been the part. How do you think in the 21st century are we trying to keep that into mind and restructuring things?
So public space has always been important, whether it was, like you said, the mohallas, chowks, gullies that we had in yesteryears, or today, like, the bazaar has got transformed into what? It's actually become a shopping mall. So people go and spend time in the shopping mall. It becomes a destination where you want to hang out, where you want to meet friends, you could do family outings. So this is sort of the 21st century version, or probably even the 20th century version to our public spaces of earlier times. So however, the need for them still remains very much so. So I think we need to understand that these spaces should be accessible to everybody. They can't become inclusive spaces that only those who can afford can go there. That's not how our gullies used to be in earlier times. So it's very important that from a design point of view, we make these as inclusive for society as possible.
And talking about public spaces, outdoor spaces now, I think the way the last year has gone, people have started appreciating outdoor spaces a lot more, and in general also people feel that to get it into a part of their day-to-day life or anything is becoming more and more important. How do you consider that technology can actually help designers like yourself in designing things in outdoor nowadays?
So technology has become something part and parcel of our lives. We can't live without it. So let's use it to its best. And even in the design of public spaces, I would say one of the very important elements of technology is security. Earlier, if certain streets or plazas could be considered unsafe, or certain parts of the city could be public spaces there could be considered unsafe. Today we have technology where at a mere button you could have CCTV cameras, you could be controlling all that from anywhere. So I think in that sense it's a positive development which technology can bring. Similarly, technology allows, today you have talking lampposts where you approach a lamppost and it will tell you all about the weather, the climate, where you can park your car or you can't park your car. So technology is everywhere, and I think if we use it in a positive manner, or it's artificial intelligence or even virtual reality, all these aspects can become very much, you don't have to have physical screens in a plaza to watch a match. You can actually have it just out there in thin air. You can be projecting, you have projection mapping happening. So many techniques, facades, facade lighting, you have digital facades where you can be communicating to the public just with facade, changing the information on that screen. So all these aspects, I think, just can go ahead and enliven our public spaces. The second thing you talked about, yes, post-pandemic, or this pandemic has taught us about our yearning for nature. We do love our outdoors. We cannot live without our outdoors. So how do we conserve them? How do we treat them specially? It could be our lakes, it could be our gardens, it could be our riverfront. So these public spaces, I feel, are really what give a soul to a city. And it's very important that just the way we think about designing our homes or our buildings, we need to think that these open spaces also need that kind of attention in design.
Dikshu, nowadays, the migration has increased a lot. There is a lot of influx of people inside big cities. Public spaces are getting more and more crowded. How do you think that you can redesign these spaces for better accessibility and even availability?
So urban migration is a serious issue plaguing our cities today, because more and more people are coming into cities, and therefore we feel that we need to densify our cities, we need to build more. And where do we build? It's at the cost of public spaces. And that, I think, is a very dangerous phenomena, because the need is there, but that doesn't mean that there's no need for that open space in the city. So if you look around the country, what's happening, whether it's Delhi or Chennai or Bangalore, the lakes are disappearing, whether it's the parks in Mumbai or in other cities, we are eating up our public spaces in the garb of saying that we need more to build. I don't think that's the solution. These public spaces, like I keep saying, are the heart and soul of a city. That's what keeps the city going. What we need is, there are alternatives to all of this. Urban migration is not something new to us. It's happened all over the world. A, we need to control urban migration, and there are ways to do that at the policy making level. And B, if there will still be continuing to be urban migration, we need to look at other solutions in planning which are there. Whether we create satellite towns around the main big cities, whether we shift some of the big functions of a city like governance or education, creates hubs of different fields around the city, or many such policies that can be implemented. Certainly what we shouldn't do is gobble away our parks or our plazas or our lakes. So I think that's something that really needs to be looked at very carefully.
Dikshu, this is a point I think I would have never paid attention to, very interestingly, like you're saying, there should be hubs created. I think that's the best idea. We see it in Europe, there will be a university section where all universities will be together, and then there are a lot of places where people can actually have fun and have a good time, and the same community also lives together. I think that is a way forward. Thank you so much, because this is going to be helpful to people who are watching this, and for policymakers also who are listening to us talking about it. Thank you so much. Well, this brings us to the end of this episode of Deciphering Design with Dikshu. We hope you enjoyed watching it as much we did while making it. Do not forget to watch us same time next week.